I was standing at my father's graveside in Arlington National Cemetery, watching the honor guard fold the American flag with military precision, when my phone started vibrating in my pocket. Dad had been a Marine, served 2 tours in Vietnam, and deserved every bit of the ceremony they were giving him. The 21 gun salute still echoed in my ears as I ignored the first call, then the second. By the third, my wife Sarah leaned over and whispered that maybe I should check it. The name on the screen made my jaw clench. Patricia Henderson, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association in Fairfax, Virginia. I'd dealt with her petty complaints for the past 3 years since moving into the neighborhood, but even she wouldn't be cruel enough to bother me today. She knew about the funeral. The whole neighborhood knew. We'd posted the obituary, and Sarah had personally informed the HOA board that we'd be away for 2 days. I silenced the phone and slipped it back into my pocket, turning my attention back to the chaplain's final words. My mother stood beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel her wedding ring digging into my skin. My sister Emily was on her other side, tears streaming down her face. This was supposed to be a moment of closure, of honoring a man who'd given everything to his country and his family. Patricia Henderson and her ridiculous HOA regulations could wait. After the ceremony, we gathered at my parents' house in Alexandria for the reception. Mom had insisted on hosting despite her grief, needing the distraction of feeding people and accepting condolences. I was in the kitchen, helping arrange platters of food when Sarah found me, her face pale. "Wade, you need to check your phone," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "Something's wrong." I stepped into Dad's old study and finally looked at my messages. 17 missed calls from Patricia, 12 from other HOA board members, 23 text messages, each more frantic than the last. And then I saw the photos. My guest house was gone, not damaged, not partially demolished, gone. Where the small but beautiful structure had stood in my backyard just 2 days ago, there was now nothing but a pile of rubble, splintered wood, and crushed drywall. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the images, each one showing a different angle of destruction. The maple tree I'd planted when we first moved in had been knocked over. The stone pathway Sarah had spent weeks laying by hand was torn up. Even the garden fence was damaged. I called Patricia back immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Mr. Norton, finally. I've been trying to reach you all day." What the hell happened to my property? My voice was level, controlled. Years as a federal prosecutor had taught me never to show emotion before I understood the full situation. Well, that's what I've been trying to explain. The board held an emergency meeting yesterday, and we determined that your guest house was in violation of county codes and HOA regulations. Since you weren't responding to our notices, we took action. Notices? What notices? I've been at my father's funeral. Yes, well, we sent you an email last week about the violation. When you didn't respond within the required 48 hours, we had no choice but to proceed with remediation. I pulled the phone away from my ear and put her on speaker so I could check my email. There it was, buried between spam messages and work correspondence. One email from the HOA, sent 6 days ago at 11 p.m. The subject line read, "Urgent. Structural violation requires immediate attention. Patricia, you sent one email at 11 o'clock at night, and when I didn't respond within 2 days, you demolished a building on my property? The regulations are very clear, Mr. Norton. Section 12, paragraph 4, states that any unpermitted structure must be removed within 72 hours of notification. Your guest house was built without proper HOA approval." That's completely false. I have all the permits from when we built it 4 years ago. Every single one was approved by the county and the HOA board. This is insane. Those permits were for a storage shed, not a guest house with plumbing and electricity. That requires different approval, which you never obtained. I felt my face getting hot. We converted the shed to a guest house 2 years ago and submitted all the proper paperwork. Your predecessor, Robert Chen, approved everything. Well, I'm not Robert Chen, and I don't see any such approval in our records. The current board made the decision to remedy this violation. The demolition cost $12,000, which will be added to your HOA account. You have 30 days to pay. You demolished my building while I was burying my father, and now you want me to pay for it? The timing is unfortunate, But rules are rules, Mr. Norton. Perhaps if you'd been more responsive to our communications, this could have been avoided. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. Sarah was standing in the doorway, and from her expression, she'd heard enough. "They can't do that, can they?" she asked. "No, they absolutely cannot." I was already pulling up the file on my computer, where I kept all our home documents. This is destruction of property, trespassing, possibly criminal conversion. Patricia Henderson just made the biggest mistake of her life. My name is Wade Norton, and I'm a federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of Virginia. I've spent the last 12 years putting away corrupt politicians, white-collar criminals, and people who think they're above the law. I've never used my position for personal matters, never pulled rank or made threats. But as I looked at those photos of my destroyed guest house, I knew that was about to change. Not because I wanted special treatment, but because Patricia Henderson had committed multiple felonies, and she was going to face justice for them. The next morning, I drove back to Fairfax and went straight to my house. The destruction was even worse in person. The guest house where my mother-in-law had stayed during her cancer treatment, where Sarah's brother had lived for 6 months after his divorce, where we'd planned to house my father if his health had continued declining, was completely demolished. The contractors had clearly used heavy equipment because the foundation was cracked and the destruction had spread to the surrounding yard. My neighbor, Tom Richardson, came over when he saw me standing there. "Wade, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop them. I really did. Called the police, but they said it was a civil matter since the HOA claimed they had authorization." "What time did they start?" "Around 8 a.m. yesterday. Big crew, 2 trucks, a small excavator. Patricia was here supervising the whole thing, acting like she'd won the lottery. I recorded some of it on my phone if you need evidence." "Send it to me, everything you've got." Tom nodded grimly. "She's been on a power trip ever since she became president last year. You're the 4th person she's targeted. The Johnsons had to repaint their house twice because she claimed the color was off by half a shade. The Mitchells got fined $5,000 for their Halloween decorations. And old Mr. Peterson had to tear down the wheelchair ramp he just built because it was 2 inches wider than regulations allowed. Why hasn't anyone sued her? Most people can't afford it, and the ones who can don't want the hassle. Patricia works for some big law firm in D.C., and she makes sure everyone knows it. She's got lawyers on speed dial." I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "So do I." First, I called my insurance company to document the damage. Then I called a structural engineer to assess what the demolition had done to my property's foundation and surrounding structures. Then I called my lawyer, Marcus Webb, who specialized in property law. "They did what?" Marcus sounded incredulous when I explained the situation. "Demolished it. Complete destruction, while I was at my father's funeral." "That's not just a civil matter, Wade. That's criminal. We're talking about destruction of property, trespassing, potentially theft if they removed any of your possessions from the building first." "There were possessions. Furniture, my father's military memorabilia that I was storing there, some of Sarah's photography equipment. All gone. Document everything, every single item you can remember. Get statements from neighbors. And Wade, don't contact the HOA board directly anymore. Let me handle all communication from here." But I wasn't planning to just sit back and let my lawyer handle it. I'd spent years building cases, understanding exactly how to investigate crimes and build prosecutions. I knew how to gather evidence, how to interview witnesses, how to find the truth buried under lies and bureaucracy. And I was going to use every bit of that knowledge now. I started with the county records. Every permit, every approval, every piece of paperwork related to my property. I pulled the original building permits from 2021, the conversion permits from 2023, and every single communication with the HOA about the project. Robert Chen, the previous HOA president, had signed off on everything. His approval was right there in black and white, dated and notarized. Next, I requested copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past 2 years. As a homeowner, I had the legal right to access these records. Patricia tried to delay, claiming she needed to review them first, but I sent her a formal legal demand through Marcus. The documents arrived 3 days later, and what I found was illuminating. Patricia Henderson had become HOA president 14 months ago after running on a platform of restoring order and property values. Her first act had been to fire the management company that had been handling HOA affairs for a decade and take direct control herself. Her second act had been to pass new regulations that essentially gave her unlimited power to determine violations and enforce penalties without a full board vote. The meeting minutes showed a disturbing pattern. Over the past year, she'd issued violations to 23 different homeowners. 15 had paid fines ranging from $500 to $5,000. 4 had been forced to make expensive modifications to their properties. 3 were in ongoing disputes. And then there was me, the only one who'd actually had property demolished. I noticed something else interesting. Every homeowner who'd been targeted was someone who'd voted against Patricia in the HOA election. I pulled the voting records, which were also public to homeowners, and the correlation was nearly perfect. She was using her position to wage a personal vendetta. That evening, I sat down with Sarah and went through everything I'd found. "This is insane," she said, shaking her head. "She's like a dictator with a homeowners association instead of a country." The worst part is she's been getting away with it because most people don't know their rights. They think the HOA is all-powerful, that they have to comply with whatever demands are made, but HOAs are bound by law just like any other entity. They can't violate county codes, they can't ignore their own bylaws, and they definitely can't destroy property without due process. So what do? We fight back, publicly, legally, and thoroughly. The next day, I filed a police report with the Fairfax County Police Department. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but initially tried to classify it as a civil dispute. "Officer, this is criminal destruction of property," I explained. "The HOA had no legal right to demolish my building. They didn't obtain a court order, they didn't follow proper procedures, and they destroyed personal property worth tens of thousands of dollars. But they're the HOA. Don't they have authority over property in the neighborhood? Not to commit crimes, they don't. If I broke into Patricia Henderson's house and demolished her kitchen because I claimed it violated some made-up rule, would you tell her it was a civil matter?" He considered that. "Point taken. I'll forward this to the detective division. I also filed a complaint with the Virginia State Bar. Patricia's LinkedIn profile proudly proclaimed that she was a licensed attorney, and if she was using legal threats to intimidate homeowners while knowingly violating the law herself, that was an ethics violation. The complaint process would take months, but I wanted it on record. Then I did something that would prove crucial. I hired a private investigator. James Kowalski was a former FBI agent who now ran his own investigation firm. I'd worked with him on several federal cases, and I trusted him completely. "I need everything you can find on Patricia Henderson," I told him. "Professional background, financial records, any previous legal issues. And I want to know about the demolition company she used. Who are they? How did she find them? And did they know they were demolishing property without owner consent?" James called me back 2 days later with information that made my jaw drop. "Wade, you're not going to believe this. The demolition company, Rapid Response Contractors, is owned by Patricia Henderson's brother-in-law, Dennis Moore. She's been steering HOA contracts to him for the past year. New sidewalks, tree removal, repairs to the community center, all of it going to Dennis's company at what appear to be inflated prices. That's self-dealing. That's embezzlement. It gets better. I pulled the HOA financial records, the ones filed with the state. There are some interesting discrepancies. Money being allocated for projects that don't seem to exist. Expenses that don't match up with the meeting minutes. I think she's been skimming." "How much?" "Rough estimate? Somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 over the past year." I sat back in my chair, processing this. What had started as an outrageous case of property destruction was now looking like a full-blown corruption scheme. Patricia Henderson wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president, she was a criminal. "James, I need you to document all of this. Bank records, contracts, invoices, everything. Make it bulletproof." "Already on it." I spent the next week building my case like I was preparing for trial. I interviewed 12 different homeowners who'd had run-ins with Patricia. Their stories were remarkably consistent: arbitrary violations, excessive fines, threats of legal action, and in several cases, demands for payment that didn't align with actual HOA regulations. Mrs. Chen, An elderly woman who lived 3 streets over broke down crying when I spoke to her. She fined me $3,000 because my rose bushes were too tall, she said. I've been growing those roses for 15 years. They're my hobby, my joy. But she said they violated some regulation about sight lines. When I tried to fight it, she threatened to put a lien on my house. I'm on a fixed income. I couldn't afford a lawyer, so I paid the fine and cut down my roses. Did you ever see this regulation in writing? No, she just said it existed. I checked the HOA bylaws. There was no such regulation. Patricia had made it up. Another homeowner, David Martinez, had been fined for parking his work truck in his driveway. I'm a plumber. I need my truck for work. But Patricia said commercial vehicles weren't allowed in the neighborhood. Never mind that half the street has people who park their company cars in their driveways. She targeted me specifically. Did you pay the fine? I fought it for 3 months, but eventually, yes. She was threatening to take me to court, and I couldn't afford that. The fine was $1,500, and it nearly bankrupted me. Again, I checked the bylaws. Commercial vehicles over a certain size were restricted, but David's truck didn't meet that threshold. Another made-up violation. The pattern was clear. Patricia Henderson was using her position to extort money from homeowners, enriching herself and her family in the process, and targeting anyone who challenged her authority. And she'd been so confident in her power that she'd demolished my property while I was burying my father, never thinking there would be consequences. She was about to learn otherwise. 2 weeks after the demolition, I received a formal bill from the HOA, $12,000 for remediation of unpermitted structure. The letter was full of legal language, threats of liens, and demands for immediate payment. It was signed by Patricia Henderson with her title prominently displayed, HOA President J.D. I called an emergency HOA meeting, which was my right as a homeowner under Virginia law. Patricia tried to refuse, but when Marcus sent her a letter explaining that she was legally required to hold the meeting within 10 days of my request, she grudgingly agreed. The meeting was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening. I'd spread the word through the neighborhood, and the room was packed. Nearly 100 homeowners showed up, far more than the usual 5 or 6 who attended regular meetings. Patricia sat at the front table with the other board members, Kenneth Baker, treasurer, Linda Morrison, secretary, and Robert Finn, member-at-large. Kenneth and Robert both looked uncomfortable. Linda kept glancing at Patricia nervously. "This meeting will come to order," Patricia announced, banging a gavel. "Mr. Norton has requested this meeting to discuss his property violation. Mr. Norton, you have 5 minutes. "I'll take as much time as I need," I said, standing up. "And we're not here to discuss a property violation. We're here to discuss multiple crimes committed by you and this board." The room went silent. Patricia's face flushed red. "How dare you! You demolished my property without legal authority while I was at my father's funeral. You destroyed personal belongings worth over $40,000. You did this based on a false claim that my guest house was unpermitted, when in fact all permits were properly obtained and approved by the previous HOA board. That's criminal destruction of property." I pulled out a thick folder of documents and held it up. I have every permit, every approval, every piece of correspondence. The guest house was completely legal. You knew that. Or you should have known that if you'd bothered to check before ordering its destruction. "The current board didn't have those approvals on file," Patricia said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Because you purged the files when you took office. I have statements from Robert Chen confirming that he gave you all previous approvals, and you threw them away. That's destruction of records, which is also illegal under Virginia HOA law." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Patricia looked around, clearly losing control of the room. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've discovered that you've been engaged in a pattern of corruption and embezzlement. You've been steering HOA contracts to your brother-in-law's company at inflated prices. You've been imposing fake fines based on regulations that don't exist, and you've been pocketing the difference." "That's slander!" Patricia jumped to her feet. "I'll sue you for every penny you have." "It's not slander if it's true, and I have bank records, contracts, and testimony from multiple homeowners proving every word I just said." I looked at Kenneth Baker. "Ken, as treasurer, did you authorize the $12,000 payment to rapid response contractors for demolishing my guest house?" Kenneth's face went pale. No, I didn't know about it until after it happened. Did you know that Rapid Response Contractors is owned by Dennis Moore, Patricia's brother-in-law? What? No! I turned to Linda Morrison. Linda, as secretary, did you record minutes from the emergency meeting where the board supposedly authorized demolishing my property? There was no meeting, Linda whispered. Patricia said it was an emergency action that didn't require a vote. The room exploded. Homeowners were shouting questions, demanding answers. Patricia was yelling back, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The truth was out. I waited for the noise to die down, then continued. I filed a police report. I filed a complaint with the state bar. And I'm filing a civil lawsuit for the destruction of my property, seeking compensatory damages, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. But more than that, I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove Patricia Henderson as HOA president and to dissolve the current board pending a full audit of HOA finances. You can't do that, Patricia shrieked. Actually, I can. Under the HOA bylaws, any homeowner can call for a recall vote with a petition signed by 25% of residents. I have signatures from 40%. I pulled out another document and handed it to Marcus, who walked it up to the board table. Patricia snatched it and read through it, her face getting redder with each page. This is mutiny, she hissed. No, this is accountability, something you've avoided for far too long. The vote was held right there, with Marcus acting as an independent vote counter. Out of 93 homeowners present, 87 voted to recall Patricia Henderson and dissolve the current board. Only 6 voted against it, and I suspected most of those were mistake votes or people who didn't understand what they were voting for. Patricia gathered her papers and stormed out, but not before turning to me and saying, "You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Norton. I will destroy you." "Looking forward to it," I replied calmly. The next morning, I got a call from Detective Sarah Mullins of the Fairfax County Police Department. "Mr. Norton, I've been assigned to your case. I've reviewed your complaint and the evidence you submitted. I'd like to bring Ms. Henderson in for questioning. Would you be available to give a formal statement?" "Absolutely." I spent 3 hours at the police station, walking Detective Mullins through everything. She was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions and taking copious notes. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of property destruction I've seen," she said. "Usually, these HOA disputes are murky, with both sides having some legitimate grievances. But this? She just demolished your building without any legal authority whatsoever. What about the embezzlement? That's trickier. We'll need to bring in forensic accountants to go through the HOA finances. That could take months. But the destruction charge? We can move on that immediately." Good. 3 days later, Patricia Henderson was arrested at her office in downtown D.C. The charge, felony destruction of property. The bail was set at $50,000, which she posted immediately, but the damage to her reputation was done. Her law firm put her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the case. Her neighbors started avoiding her, and the new interim HOA board, led by Tom Richardson, immediately began cooperating with the police investigation. The forensic audit of HOA finances took 6 weeks. When the results came back, they were damning. Patricia had embezzled $63,000 over 14 months using a variety of schemes: fake invoices, inflated contracts to her brother-in-law's company, and direct transfers that she'd disguised as administrative expenses. She'd also collected over $40,000 in fake fines from homeowners, money that had gone into her personal bank account rather than the HOA's general fund. The detective called me with the update. "We're adding charges: embezzlement, fraud, and racketeering. The U.S. Attorney's Office is considering whether to bring federal charges as well, since some of the money was transferred across state lines. Let me know if you need any help with the prosecution." "Actually, that's why I'm calling. The county prosecutor wants to meet with you. He's hoping you might be willing to consult on the case, given your background." I met with Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Robert Lawson the next day. He was young, maybe 30, with an earnest face and a firm handshake. "Mr. Norton, I'll be honest with you. This case should be straightforward, but Patricia Henderson has hired one of the best defense attorneys in Virginia, Thomas Ridley. You know him?" I knew him. Thomas Ridley was a bulldog who specialized in getting white-collar criminals off on technicalities. He was expensive, aggressive, and very good at his job. He's already filing motions to suppress evidence, claiming the HOA financial records were obtained illegally. He's arguing that as a private organization, the HOA has privacy rights that were violated. That's nonsense. HOA records are required by law to be available to homeowners. There was no illegal search. I know that, and you know that, but he's good at muddying the waters. I could use your expertise in building a case that's absolutely bulletproof. I'll help however I can, but I can't officially join the prosecution team. I'm a witness and a victim. Understood. But unofficially, I'd love your advice. We spent hours going through the evidence, organizing it, anticipating defense arguments, and building a narrative that would resonate with a jury. Robert was smart and willing to learn, and together we constructed a case that would be very difficult for even Thomas Ridley to crack. The criminal trial was set for 6 months out, but my civil lawsuit moved faster. Marcus filed in Fairfax County Circuit Court, and we were assigned Judge Elizabeth Winters, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for fairness. The civil trial began on a cold morning in February, 4 months after Patricia had demolished my guest house. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious neighbors, and legal observers. Patricia sat at the defense table with Thomas Ridley and another attorney from his firm. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by the stress of the criminal charges and the public scrutiny. Marcus made our opening statement, laying out the facts in clear, simple language. Permitted building, illegal demolition, destroyed property, financial harm. He showed the jury photos of the guest house before and after, presented the permits and approvals, and explained how Patricia had acted without authority and in bad faith. Thomas Ridley's opening was classic misdirection. He talked about property values and community standards, about the importance of HOA regulations in maintaining neighborhood integrity. He painted Patricia as a dedicated volunteer who'd made a difficult decision to protect the community. He suggested that I was using my position as a federal prosecutor to bully a civic-minded citizen. The first few days of trial were spent establishing the facts. I testified about the building permits, the conversion process, and the communications with the previous HOA board. Robert Chen testified that he'd approved everything and given all the documents to Patricia when she took office. The structural engineer testified about the extent of the damage. Sarah testified about the personal property that had been destroyed, including irreplaceable items like my father's military medals and photos. When it was Patricia's turn to testify, Thomas Ridley walked her through a carefully scripted narrative. She'd found what she believed was an unpermitted structure. She'd tried to contact me. She'd made what she thought was the right decision for the community. She expressed regret for the timing, acknowledged that it had been handled poorly, but maintained that she'd acted within her authority as HOA president. Marcus destroyed her on cross-examination. Ms. Henderson, you claim you tried to contact Mr. Norton before ordering the demolition. How many times did you try to call him? I sent an email. One email, sent at 11 p.m., 6 days before the demolition. Is that correct? Yes. And when you didn't get a response within 48 hours, you ordered the demolition? The bylaws require a response within 72 hours. Actually, they don't. Can you show me where in the bylaws it says that? Patricia fumbled with the bylaws document. It's in Section 12. Section 12 says that homeowners must be given 30 days to remedy violations before any enforcement action is taken. You gave Mr. Norton less than a week. It was an emergency situation. What was the emergency? The guest house had been standing for 4 years. What changed that suddenly made it such a pressing danger that it had to be demolished while Mr. Norton was burying his father? Patricia had no good answer. She stammered something about structural concerns, but when Marcus asked if she'd had the structure inspected by an engineer, she admitted she hadn't. Ms. Henderson, you've been charged with embezzling over $60,000 from the HOA. Is that correct? I'm not going to comment on pending criminal charges. Fair enough. But you did direct multiple HOA contracts to rapid response contractors owned by your brother-in-law, correct? That's not illegal. I didn't ask if it was illegal. I asked if you did it. Yes. And you did so without disclosing your relationship to the board or the homeowners? I didn't think it was necessary. You didn't think it was necessary to disclose that you were funneling HOA funds to a family member? Thomas Ridley objected, but the damage was done. The jury could see exactly who Patricia Henderson was, a corrupt official who'd abused her power for personal gain. The defense tried to present witnesses who would testify to Patricia's good character, but Marcus had anticipated this. He called 6 homeowners who'd been victims of Patricia's fake fines and arbitrary enforcement. Each one told their story, and by the time they were done, the jury looked disgusted. Closing arguments were straightforward. Marcus asked for $200,000 in compensatory damages, the cost of rebuilding the guest house, replacing the destroyed property, and repairing the damage to the surrounding yard. He also asked for $500,000 in punitive damages, arguing that Patricia's conduct was so egregious that she needed to be punished to deter others from similar behavior. Thomas Ridley argued that we were asking for too much, that Patricia had made an honest mistake, that punitive damages weren't warranted. But his heart didn't seem in it. He knew his client was guilty. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they came back, they awarded us $250,000 in compensatory damages and $750,000 in punitive damages, $1 million total plus attorney's fees. Patricia gasped when she heard the verdict. Thomas Ridley tried to console her, but she pushed him away and ran from the courtroom. I felt no satisfaction in her distress, only a grim sense of justice. The criminal trial began 2 months later. The Commonwealth's attorney had added charges based on the civil trial testimony, perjury for lying under oath about the bylaws, and obstruction for destroying HOA records. Combined with the embezzlement and fraud charges, Patricia was facing up to 20 years in prison. Thomas Ridley tried every trick in his playbook. He filed motions to dismiss, motions to suppress, motions for change of venue. Judge Michael Chen, no relation to Robert, denied them all. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too clear. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, homeowners, accountants, bank officials, police investigators. They traced every dollar Patricia had stolen, documented every fake fine, proved every lie. The defense had almost nothing to work with. Patricia didn't testify, which was probably wise given how poorly she'd done in the civil trial. The jury found her guilty on all counts. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, the Virginia State Bar concluded their investigation and disbarred Patricia. Her law license, which she'd worked so hard to obtain and maintain, was gone. Her legal career was over. When sentencing day arrived, Judge Chen was blunt. "Ms. Henderson, you held a position of trust within your community. Homeowners relied on you to manage their collective interests fairly and honestly. Instead, you used that position to enrich yourself, to settle personal grudges, and to bully people who couldn't fight back. Your conduct was deplorable." He sentenced her to 12 years in prison, with all but 6 suspended, meaning she'd serve at least 3 years before being eligible for parole. He also ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me, on top of the civil judgment. Patricia was led away in handcuffs, crying. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd destroyed her own life through greed and pettiness, but a larger part of me felt satisfied that justice had been served. Dennis Moore, Patricia's brother-in-law, was also charged with conspiracy and fraud. He pleaded guilty and received 2 years in prison plus restitution. His business folded, and the contracts he'd been awarded were rebid to legitimate companies. The new HOA board, with Tom Richardson as president, was everything the old one wasn't: transparent, responsive, and fair. They updated the bylaws to include better oversight and term limits. They hired a professional management company. And they personally apologized to every homeowner who'd been wronged by Patricia. Tom came over one evening while I was overseeing the reconstruction of my guest house. Insurance had covered most of it, and the civil judgment would cover the rest once it was collected. "Wade, I wanted to thank you," he said. "If you hadn't fought back, Patricia would still be terrorizing the neighborhood. I just wanted my guest house back. It was more than that. You showed everyone that bullies can be stopped, that people in power can be held accountable. That matters." He was right, I supposed, but mostly I was just tired. The past 8 months had been exhausting. burying my father, fighting Patricia, navigating 2 trials. I wanted things to return to normal. Sarah and I were sitting on our back porch a few weeks later, watching the sunset, when she said, "Do you regret it? Using your skills to go after Patricia?" I thought about it. No, she committed crimes, serious ones. She hurt people. That's what I do. What I've always done, hold people accountable when they break the law. The fact that it was personal this time doesn't change that. You could have just let the police handle it. I could have, but I had the knowledge and resources to build a better case. Why wouldn't I use them? She smiled and squeezed my hand. That's what I love about you. You never back down from what's right. The guest house was completed in early May, almost exactly 1 year after it had been demolished. It was beautiful, maybe even nicer than before. We'd upgraded some of the features, added better insulation, installed new windows. My mother came for the dedication, bringing flowers and tears. "Your father would be proud," she said. "He always taught you to stand up for yourself." "He did. And he'd love this." She gestured at the guest house. "A place for family to gather. That's all he ever wanted." We held a barbecue that weekend, inviting all the neighbors who'd supported us through the ordeal. The yard was full of people, laughter, and the smell of grilled food. Tom Richardson gave a toast thanking me again for standing up to Patricia. Others shared their own stories of dealing with HOA tyranny, and there was a collective sense of relief that those days were over. As I stood there, surrounded by friends and neighbors, with Sarah at my side and my mother smiling for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt a sense of closure. The guest house was rebuilt. Patricia was in prison. The neighborhood was healing. Justice had been served. But more than that, I'd learned something important, that the law applies to everyone, regardless of how powerful they think they are. Patricia Henderson had thought she was untouchable, that her position and her law degree gave her carte blanche to do whatever she wanted. She'd learned the hard way that no one is above the law. I'd spent my career prosecuting people who believed they were special, who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Corrupt politicians who enriched themselves at taxpayer expense, corporate executives who defrauded investors, officials who abused their power. Patricia Henderson was just another name on that list, another person who discovered that actions have consequences. The interesting thing was how much support we'd received once people understood what was happening. The media had covered the trial extensively, and it had sparked a national conversation about HOA abuse. Homeowners across the country shared their own horror stories. State legislators started proposing reforms. The Community Associations Institute, which represents HOAs, issued new guidelines about transparency and accountability. One evening, I received a call from a reporter at the Washington Post who was writing a feature about HOA reform. "Mr. Norton, your case has become something of a rallying cry for homeowners' rights. How does that feel?" I never set out to be anyone's rallying cry. I just wanted justice for what was done to my property. But you've inspired a lot of people. We've heard from dozens of homeowners who say your case gave them the courage to fight back against their own HOAs. Good. They should fight back. HOAs serve an important function, but they're not kingdoms. They have to follow the law like everyone else. Do you think there should be more regulation of HOAs? Absolutely. Right now, HOAs operate with very little oversight. Board members often have no training, no accountability, and too much power. There need to be clearer standards, better enforcement mechanisms, and easier ways for homeowners to challenge abuses. The article ran a week later on the front page of the Metro section. It was fair and thorough, quoting me, Tom Richardson, several other homeowners, and legal experts. It painted Patricia as an extreme example of a systemic problem and called for legislative action. Virginia Delegate Jennifer Walsh read the article and reached out to me. She was drafting a bill to reform HOA regulations in Virginia and wanted my input. "Mr. Norton, your case highlighted serious gaps in our current laws. I'd like to close those gaps." We met several times over the following months. The bill she eventually proposed included several key provisions: mandatory training for HOA board members, stricter disclosure requirements for financial conflicts of interest, clearer procedures for enforcement actions, and an expedited arbitration process for homeowner disputes. It also made it a criminal offense to destroy property without following proper legal procedures. The bill passed the Virginia House and Senate with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor. It was nicknamed Wade's Law by some legislators, though officially it was called the Homeowners Association Transparency and Accountability Act. I testified at the bill signing ceremony, keeping my remarks brief. No one should go through what my family went through. No one should have their property destroyed while they're burying a loved one. This law won't prevent every abuse, but it will make it harder for bad actors to hide behind HOA authority. The governor shook my hand and thanked me for my advocacy. It was surreal, being celebrated for something I'd never wanted to be part of in the first place. But if some good came from Patricia's crimes, I supposed that was worth something. Life gradually returned to normal. I went back to work full-time, prosecuting cases and building investigations. Sarah resumed her photography business. My mother moved into a retirement community in Alexandria, close enough that we could visit regularly. The guest house became exactly what we'd always intended, a place for family and friends. Patricia served 3 years in prison before being released on parole. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to North Carolina to live with her sister, working as a paralegal at a small firm. Her law license was gone forever, and she'd never be able to serve on an HOA board again. The $1 million judgment had forced her into bankruptcy, and she'd lost her house, her savings, everything. Her husband had divorced her while she was in prison. Part of me wondered if the punishment had been too severe, if we'd destroyed her life over what started as a property dispute. But then I remembered Mrs. Chen crying about her roses, David Martinez struggling to pay a fake fine, all the other homeowners Patricia had victimized. She hadn't just demolished my guest house, she'd terrorized an entire community for over a year. She'd stolen money from families, some of whom could barely afford it. She'd abused every bit of power she'd been given. No, the punishment fit the crime. 3 years after the trial, I was invited to speak at a national conference on community association law in Denver, Colorado. Lawyers, HOA board members, and property managers from across the country attended. I was on a panel about accountability and oversight. During the Q&A session, a woman in the audience stood up. She was probably in her 50s, well-dressed, with an air of confidence. "Mr. Norton, I'm an HOA president in Florida. After hearing your story, I went back and reviewed our own procedures. I discovered that our bylaws gave me way too much unilateral power. So I worked with the board to reform them, adding checks and balances, requiring more transparency. We've had 0 disputes in the 2 years since. I just wanted to thank you for making me think about how I was using my authority." The room applauded, and I felt genuinely moved. This was what it was all about. Not vengeance against Patricia, but creating a better system that protected homeowners while still allowing communities to maintain standards. Another person asked, "Do you think HOAs are inherently problematic?" "No," I said. HOAs serve important functions. They maintain common areas, enforce basic standards, handle collective issues that individual homeowners can't manage alone. The problem isn't HOAs themselves, it's when they're run by people who abuse their power. That's true of any organization, any government, any system of authority. The solution is accountability, transparency, and clear rules that apply to everyone. After the conference, several people approached me about consulting on HOA reform efforts in their states. I declined most of them, not wanting to become some kind of professional HOA crusader. But I did agree to help draft model legislation that could be adapted by different states, working with a coalition of property law experts and homeowner advocates. The model legislation was published 2 years later and has been adopted, in whole or in part, by 12 states. It's not perfect, and there's still a long way to go, but it represents real progress in protecting homeowners from abusive HOAs while preserving the legitimate functions these organizations serve. Looking back now, 5 years after Patricia demolished my guest house, I can see how that terrible day changed my life in ways I never expected. It forced me to use my legal skills in a personal context to fight for myself and my community in a way I'd never done before. It led to legislative reforms that have helped thousands of homeowners. It reminded me why I became a prosecutor in the first place, to stand up for people who are wronged, to hold the powerful accountable, to ensure that justice is more than just an abstract concept. The guest house stands in my backyard, solid and beautiful. My mother stays there when she visits. Sarah's brother used it again when he was between jobs last year. Friends crash there after late dinners. It's a place of family, comfort, and continuity, exactly as we always envisioned. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in the guest house, I think about my father's funeral, about standing at his grave while Patricia was ordering the demolition. I think about how that moment of grief became the catalyst for everything that followed. Dad would have appreciated the irony. He'd always taught me to stand up to bullies, to fight for what was right, to never let powerful people push you around. In a way, fighting Patricia was the last lesson he taught me, even though he wasn't there to see it. He'd spent his life defending his country, standing up for principles, refusing to back down in the face of adversity. I'd spent my career doing something similar in the courtroom. When Patricia demolished my guest house, she gave me the chance to honor both those legacies. I won't say I'm grateful for what she did. The pain of that day, the stress of the trials, the months of fighting, none of that was worth it. But I'm proud of how I responded. I'm proud that we stood up to a bully and won. I'm proud that our fight led to changes that protect other people. And I'm proud that when I stand in my backyard and look at that guest house, I see not just a building, but a testament to the principle that no one is above the law, that power without accountability is tyranny, and that sometimes regular people can fight City Hall and win. Patricia Henderson thought she could demolish my guest house without consequences. She thought her position as HOA president gave her unlimited authority. She thought wrong. Because at the end of the day, I'm not just a homeowner. I'm a federal prosecutor with 12 years of experience building cases and taking down people who abuse power. Patricia picked the wrong person to bully, the wrong property to destroy, and the wrong time to do it. She's paying for that mistake now, and will be for the rest of her life. And every time I walk past my guest house, every time a family member stays there, every time I hear about another state adopting HOA reform legislation, I'm reminded that justice, though sometimes slow, is real. Tom Richardson was elected HOA president for a third term last year, running unopposed. The neighborhood is thriving, property values are up, and people actually attend board meetings now because they trust that their voices will be heard. We have summer barbecues and winter holiday parties. Kids play in the streets. It's become the kind of community we all hoped for when we moved here. Last week, a new family moved in 3 houses down. I walked over to introduce myself and welcome them to the neighborhood. The husband, a software engineer named Chris, mentioned that they'd specifically chosen Meadowbrook Heights because they'd read about our HOA reforms. We were nervous about buying in an HOA neighborhood, he admitted. But when we read about what you did, how you held your board accountable and helped change the laws, we figured this was a place where homeowners had real rights. You do, I assured him, and if you ever have any problems, you let me know. He laughed. I don't think anyone's going to mess with homeowners in this neighborhood anymore, not after what happened to the last person who tried. He was probably right. Patricia Henderson's prosecution had sent a message that resonated far beyond our little neighborhood in Fairfax. HOA board members across Virginia, across the country, had learned that they couldn't act with impunity, that homeowners had rights, and that abusing power had real consequences. As I walked back to my house that evening, Sarah was in the garden, planting new roses where Patricia's demolition had torn up the old ones. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the yard. The guest house stood peacefully in the background, lights glowing warmly through the windows. "How are the new neighbors?" Sarah asked. "Nice people. They chose this neighborhood because of our HOA reforms," she smiled. "See? Something good came from all that awfulness." "Yeah, I guess it did." We stood there together, admiring our property, our home, our corner of the world that we'd fought so hard to protect. In the end, that's what it had all been about, protecting our home, standing up for what was right, and ensuring that power couldn't be abused without consequences. Patricia Henderson had demolished my guest house during my father's funeral, thinking she was untouchable. She discovered, too late, that she'd attacked a federal prosecutor who knew exactly how to build a case, exactly how to pursue justice, and exactly how to ensure that crimes were punished. The guest house was rebuilt, the HOA was reformed, the laws were changed, and Patricia, she learned that in America, no one is above the law, not even an HOA president with a law degree and an inflated sense of power. Justice was served, slowly but surely, completely and thoroughly. And every time I look at my guest house, standing strong and beautiful in my backyard, I'm reminded that fighting back against injustice, even when it's exhausting and painful, is always worth it in the end.